Black doctor falls for shy patient, but she has no idea who he really is. Subscribe for more stories. Amara Wells's hands trembled as she clutched the clipboard, her knuckles white around the pen. The Reed Women's Wellness Center waiting room was immaculate and modern, but no amount of soft lighting or gentle music could undo the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She desperately wished she were anywhere else. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the intake form. Name, date of birth, medical history. They were simple prompts, yet her mind felt like a whirlwind of static. Wiping her damp palms on her jeans, she forced herself to concentrate. Just complete the form, Amara. It isn't that complicated. Except for her, it was. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding this very moment, convinced she could get by without seeing a gynecologist. But weeks of feeling unwell, coupled with late-night internet searches that only magnified her worst fears, had finally forced her hand. The receptionist had enthusiastically recommended Dr. Malcolm Reed, praising him as one of the finest specialists in the city. Amara hadn't given it a second thought at the time. To her, a doctor was a doctor, older, detached, and clinical. Nothing could have prepared her for what was to come. A nurse with a warm smile entered the room holding a manila folder. Amara Wells? Amara nearly leapt from her seat. She swallowed hard, clutching her completed form as if it were a life raft. On shaky legs, she rose and followed the nurse down a long corridor. Her stomach churned as she passed a series of closed examination rooms, the scent of antiseptic hanging heavy in the air. "You can have a seat right here," the nurse said kindly, gesturing to a chair in the doctor's office. "Dr. Reed will be with you shortly." Amara gave a stiff nod, her breath caught in her chest. She perched on the edge of the chair, her spine rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The office was pristine, with framed degrees adorning the walls. A sleek mahogany desk occupied one corner, and next to it, the examination chair loomed like a prop from a horror film. She tried to avert her gaze, her fingers twisting together as she rehearsed her lines. Asterisk, be cool, act normal. Just get this over with, asterisk, and that's when Amara forgot how to breathe entirely. The man who entered the room was the furthest thing from the physician she had pictured. Dr. Malcolm Reed was stunningly handsome, tall with broad shoulders and a face that was effortlessly striking. The waves in his low-cut dark hair were perfect. His jaw was sculpted with clean, sharp lines, and his deep brown eyes held a disarming confidence. He wasn't supposed to look like this. Amara's mouth went completely dry. "Miss Wells." His voice was a smooth, reassuring baritone, utterly professional. He offered a gentle smile as he shut the door behind him. Amara attempted to respond, but no sound emerged. She was too consumed by a rising wave of panic. He was young, he was gorgeous, and he was about to conduct her physical exam. Oh no, this was a catastrophe. Malcolm settled into the chair across from her, his gaze scanning her patient chart. "I see this is your first visit to a gynecologist." Amara nodded so vigorously she thought she might strain her neck. Malcolm's smile remained kind. "I understand this can be a nerve-wracking experience, but I assure you, we'll proceed at your pace. Nothing will happen that you are not comfortable with." She nodded again, a hot blush creeping up her cocoa skin. Malcolm observed her tension, the way she refused to meet his gaze, the way she seemed to want to shrink into the chair. She was unlike most of the women he saw. There was a shyness, a delicate fragility about her that stirred something protective within him. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "How are you feeling at this moment?" Amara squeezed her hands together. "Fine," she squeaked, the lie thin and obvious. Malcolm let out a low chuckle, a warm, easy sound. "You don't have to be nervous with me. I promise. I'm not as intimidating as I look." Amara begged to differ. He was terrifying, not for who he was, but for what he was awakening inside her. She had never reacted to anyone this way. The racing pulse, the sweaty palms, the intense awareness of his every movement. And the most mortifying part? He saw it all. Malcolm noted her body language, her averted eyes, the lovely flush that stained her cheeks. She was utterly captivating. He had encountered thousands of patients, the confident, the anxious, even those who were overtly flirtatious. But Amara was in a league of her own. Her vulnerability made him want to be exceptionally careful with her. He had never been one to mix personal feelings with his professional life, but the way she looked at him with those wide, uncertain eyes made him want to shield her. And that was a dangerous impulse. He cleared his throat, mentally pushing the thought aside. Asterisk focus, Malcolm. You're her doctor, not a guy at a lounge asterisk before we begin, he said, his tone light and professional. Are there any questions you'd like to ask me? Amara paused. 1,000 questions swirled in her head, but they all died in her throat. She simply shook her head. Malcolm's eyes lingered on her for a beat, as if trying to decipher her silence. Then he smiled once more. All right then, let's get started. And Amara knew, with absolute certainty, this was going to be the longest appointment of her life. Amara practically sprinted from the clinic that afternoon. Her heart still pounded a frantic rhythm as she navigated the crowded sidewalk, her palms slick with sweat, her cheeks still burning with humiliation. She had never felt so completely out of her element. Dr. Malcolm Reed was simply too much, too handsome, too charming, too unnerving. And the worst part was that he had been kind, gentle, and profoundly respectful, which somehow made everything feel worse, because it meant she couldn't even be angry with him. So she was angry with herself instead. Angry at the way her stomach had somersaulted when he spoke. Angry at the way her skin tingled when he'd offered a handshake. Angry at how she had nearly dissolved into a puddle on the floor under his gaze. She could never go back. Not in a million years, she vowed. But fate, as it so often does, had different intentions. For the next 2 weeks, Amara screened every call from the clinic. Her prescription needed adjusting. She didn't care. She needed to schedule a follow-up. Not happening. But then her symptoms began to worsen, and no amount of denial was going to make them disappear. Which is how she found herself back in that same waiting room, her fingers digging into the chair's armrests as if they were her only anchor. This time, she prayed for a different doctor, someone older, plainer, someone who wouldn't make her entire nervous system short-circuit. But the universe, it seemed, was not on her side. The moment the nurse called her name and led her to the office, the person waiting inside was him, Dr. Malcolm Reed, looking as unfairly handsome as ever. He glanced up from his chart as she entered, and a knowing smile touched his lips. Amara, he said, closing the folder. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. Her breath hitched. He noticed her stomach twisted as she scurried to a seat, her eyes glued to the carpet. I wasn't, she stammered, lying through her teeth. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. His expression was a mixture of kindness, amusement, and genuine curiosity. You missed your follow-up, he stated gently. And we couldn't reach you when we called. Amara felt a fresh wave of mortification. I got really busy, she mumbled. Malcolm didn't seem to buy it for a second, but he let it go. Instead, he watched her, noting the way she fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the tension in her shoulders. She was on edge. She'd been on edge last time, too, and for some reason, that awareness softened something inside him. He'd treated countless patients, but none were quite like Amara Wells. There was something about her, a delicate quality that made him want to proceed with caution, to ensure she felt completely secure. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he hadn't anticipated. Amara, meanwhile, was fighting the urge to faint. Every second in his presence felt like a unique form of torture. She knew he was just doing his job, that he wasn't overthinking this interaction the way she was. But it didn't matter. She needed to escape. The instant the appointment concluded, she bolted for the door, murmuring a hasty thank you as she vanished down the hall. And Malcolm, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, felt a pang of disappointment as she left. He didn't expect to see her again so soon, especially not outside the clinic, not in an entirely different context. But a few days later, as he stopped by his favorite coffee shop for his pre-work caffeine fix, his eyes fell on a familiar figure curled up in a window seat with a book. It was Amara. She hadn't seen him. She was lost in her novel, occasionally tucking a stray lock behind her ear, her full lip caught between her teeth in concentration. She looked so peaceful here, a world away from the anxious woman in his office. And for a reason he couldn't name, Malcolm paused. Suddenly, she wasn't just a patient. She was someone he was curious about, not in a clinical setting, not as a name on a chart, but as a person, as Amara. Taking a steadying breath, he walked over. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, his voice smooth as he leaned against her small table. Amara froze mid-sip, her eyes widening as she looked up. For a beat, she just stared, her mind scrambling to process his presence. Then she choked on her latte. Malcolm fought back a smile. Amara wanted the floor to swallow her whole. For the second time, Dr. Malcolm Reed had caught her completely off guard. Amara clutched her mug, her heart still thudding from the shock of seeing Dr. Malcolm Reed in the wild. She had barely recovered from her last appointment, and now here he was, looking infuriatingly composed, a hint of amusement in his deep brown eyes. Hi, she managed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Malcolm chuckled softly, sliding into the opposite chair without an invitation. "I didn't realize you frequented this place," he said, glancing around the cozy cafe. "This is my usual spot," Amara swallowed, battling the panic rising in her chest. This was not how she'd envisioned their next meeting. Seeing him outside a medical context, sitting across from her as if it were the most normal thing in the world, was deeply unsettling. I like the quiet here," she mumbled, hoping he wouldn't detect the tremor in her voice. Malcolm smiled gently. "Me too." And just like that, a comfortable silence fell between them. For the first time, Amara let herself truly look at him. He was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong, bronze forearms. A luxury watch glinted on his wrist. His entire demeanor radiated a quiet power, a combination of wealth and self-assurance. He seemed to belong to a world completely separate from her own. And yet, here he was, watching her as if she were the most captivating person in the room. That thought terrified her more than anything. A few days later, Amara's perception of him shifted again. She was scrolling through her phone when a headline made her stomach plummet. Dr. Malcolm Reed, the millionaire philanthropist behind Reed Medical Group. She froze, her heart hammering. Clicking the link, her eyes widened with every word she absorbed. Malcolm wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor, a leading name in women's health, a visionary who owned a network of facilities, including the very clinic she attended. And on top of it all, he was staggeringly wealthy. Amara could hardly breathe. It wasn't just his success, it was her own naivete. She had let herself believe, even for a moment, that he was just a regular guy. But the stark reality was now staring her in the face. Malcolm Reed was not some charming local doctor. He was an institution. He was untouchable. And she was just Amara Wells, a quiet girl working in a bookstore, trying to make rent and figure out her life one day at a time. They were not in the same league. They weren't even playing the same game, and the sooner she accepted that, the better. Malcolm noticed the shift immediately. Amara was ghosting him. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, but then the unanswered texts, the missed appointments, and her absence from the coffee shop confirmed it. He suddenly realized he was at risk of losing her before he'd even had a chance to understand the connection between them. That was a prospect he refused to accept. So one evening, he found her. Amara had just ended her shift at the bookstore, her tote bag slung over her shoulder as she stepped outside. And there he was, leaning against a sleek black car, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked on her. Her heart leaped in her throat. "Malcolm," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes never left hers. "Are you avoiding me?" His tone was calm, but it held an undercurrent of something she hadn't heard before. Amara looked away. "No, I've just been busy," Malcolm sighed, pushing off the car and closing the distance between them. "Amara," he said, his voice softer now. "Don't lie to me." Her hands clenched into fists. "Why does it even matter?" she shot back. "You're you, and I'm just me. We're from different worlds, Malcolm and I." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to be seen as some girl chasing after your money." Malcolm stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a genuine, startled sound of disbelief. Amara's cheeks burned. "What's so funny?" He shook his head slowly, his expression softening into something unreadable. "Because, Amara," he murmured, "I think you might be the first person in my entire life who has ever tried to run away from me because of my wealth." Amara's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, she saw it, a flicker of weariness in his eyes, a way he looked at her not as a doctor or a millionaire, but simply as a man trying to connect. And suddenly, running away didn't seem like such a sure thing anymore. Amara did her best to maintain a safe distance from Malcolm. She found new coffee shops. She declined his invitations, first politely, then more firmly. She ignored the texts he sent just to check in, though each one sent a pang of guilt through her. But no matter how hard she tried to build a fortress around her heart, there was one thing she couldn't escape: her own feelings. Because every time his name illuminated her screen, her fingers itched to respond. Because every time she walked past the clinic, she had to physically restrain herself from glancing inside. Because every night when she closed her eyes, it was his face she saw, his voice she heard, the memory of his presence a palpable warmth. And that scared her more than anything. Malcolm Reed wasn't just a man she could fall for. He was a man she could get completely lost in. And that was an even more terrifying prospect than him simply walking away. So Amara did the only thing she knew how to do. She retreated. But Malcolm was not one to give up so easily. He gave her space at first, allowing her time to process her emotions, to reconcile whatever this fragile thing between them was. But when days bled into weeks, and Amara remained determined to keep him out, he knew he had to change his strategy. He stopped pursuing and instead simply started being there. Not in a grand, dramatic fashion, but in small, unassuming ways. At the bookstore where she worked, he'd browse the shelves, striking up casual conversation. At the coffee shop, he'd occupy his usual table, a quiet, steady presence in her periphery, never pushing, just existing. Slowly, his patient approach began to wear down her defenses. Amara stopped avoiding him. She stopped inventing excuses. And one afternoon, she found herself laughing at one of his jokes, a real, genuine laugh that bubbled up from deep inside her. For the first time in weeks, Malcolm saw a crack in her armor. But just as Amara was starting to let her guard down, starting to believe that maybe this wasn't as impossible as she'd imagined, the world tilted on its axis. It was late. She'd stayed after her shift to restock shelves, a dull headache pounding behind her eyes, her limbs heavy with fatigue. She felt off all day, but had pushed through, telling herself it was just exhaustion. But as she stepped out onto the cool night pavement, the world began to spin. Her vision blurred, her knees gave out, and everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was aware of warmth and softness. Crisp sheets were beneath her, and the rhythmic beep of a machine sounded nearby. She slowly pried her eyes open, only to be met by the last face she expected to see. Malcolm was sitting in a chair beside her hospital bed, his elbows on his knees, his handsome features etched with profound concern. The moment he saw her eyes open, he exhaled sharply, raw relief flooding his face. "Amara," he whispered, "you gave me a scare." Her throat felt like sandpaper. What happened?" "You collapsed," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "A passerby called an ambulance. When I found out you were here, He swallowed hard. "I came as fast as I could," Amara blinked, trying to process his words. He came for her. He had dropped everything for her. And in that instant, all the walls she had so carefully constructed, all the reasons she'd told herself to stay away, crumbled into dust. Amara awoke to the muted glow of hospital lights and the distant murmur of voices down the hall. Her body felt leaden, but it was the warmth of a presence beside her that drew her attention. And then she saw him. Malcolm was keeping vigil by her bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His normally composed face was shadowed with fatigue and worry, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been raking his hands through it repeatedly. When her eyes fluttered open, he let out a ragged breath, relief washing over his features. "Amara," His voice was low and gravelly with emotion. You really scared me. She blinked slowly, her mind foggy. What happened? Her throat was parched, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. Malcolm leaned closer, as if compelled to narrow the space between them. You collapsed on the street, his fingers tightened into a fist. You had a high fever. You were dehydrated, exhausted. You've been pushing yourself too hard. Amara tried to sit up, but he was there in an instant, his hands gently steadying her. And for the first time, she saw it clear as day in his eyes. Not pity, not professional duty, but something else entirely. Something tender, powerful, and unmistakably real. A painful knot formed at her chest. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't look at her like that. Because if he did, she might start to believe it. She might start to believe that someone like him, a man who had the world at his feet, could actually want someone like her. And she couldn't afford that kind of heartbreak. So she did what she always did when she felt cornered. She pushed him away. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice barely audible. Malcolm's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Amara forced her gaze away from his. You don't have to do this, his jaw clenched. Do what exactly? This, she said, gesturing weakly at the room. Taking care of me. Sitting here all night. Acting like I matter. Malcolm's posture went rigid, and his expression darkened with an intense emotion. So, he said, his voice dropping to a low, sharp tone, you think I'm here out of some sense of obligation? Her mouth opened, then closed. Because yes, that was precisely what she thought. And that possibility terrified her. She didn't want to be his project. She didn't want to be the girl he pitied. So she forced the words out. I don't need your charity, Malcolm. His eyes flashed with something she'd never seen before. Frustration, hurt, and something deeper still. This isn't charity, Amara. He clipped out, his voice taut. This is me caring about you. She let out a short, breathless, bitter laugh. What? His fingers curled at his sides. What do you mean, why? Why me? She whispered. You have everything. Money, success, women who would do anything to be with you. Her throat grew tight. So why are you here for me? His breath caught, and then he finally said it. Because I'm falling for you, Amara. Her heart stopped. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. But before she could even begin to process them, before she could allow herself to hope, the fear surged back. She shook her head, her fingers gripping the thin hospital blanket. No, she rasped, her voice trembling. That doesn't make any sense. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Why doesn't it make sense? Because, she whispered, the words tearing at her, you have everything, and I have nothing. Her voice cracked. So how am I supposed to believe you could ever need me? Silence descended, thick and absolute. Malcolm's gaze never wavered from hers. And for the first time, Amara saw a flicker of his own brokenness, and she realized that maybe she wasn't the only one who was scared. Malcolm drew a long, slow breath, his hands balling in a fist before he consciously relaxed them. For a moment, he just looked at her, his brown eyes searching, pained, and almost vulnerable in a way she'd never witnessed. Then he finally spoke. You think I have everything? He asked softly, his voice quiet but steady. That my life is perfect? That I don't know what it feels like to be inadequate? Amara frowned, a lump forming in her throat. Isn't it? Malcolm let out a short, humorless laugh. He shook his head. No, Amara. It's not. She stared at him, taken aback by the raw edge in his voice. She had always perceived Malcolm as a figure of unattainable success, immense wealth, and unshakable confidence. But now, she was seeing something else, something fractured and profoundly human. I wasn't always this person, he went on, his hands rubbing together unconsciously. I didn't grow up with a trust fund. My parents were hardworking people, but we struggled. I put myself through medical school on scholarships, and by working 2 jobs, Amara held her breath, watching as he spoke not with his usual authority, but with a quiet vulnerability that made her heart ache. When I finally became a doctor, when I started making real money, I thought I'd made it. I thought, this is it. I've done everything right, his voice dropped, becoming softer. And then I met someone. Amara's stomach clenched. She was brilliant, beautiful, everything I thought I wanted, and she told me she loved me. Malcolm's jaw set like stone. I believed her. Amara already sensed where the story was headed, but she couldn't stop herself from whispering, "What happened?" Malcolm exhaled slowly. "She didn't love me," he said, his voice laced with the sharp sting of old pain. "She loved my bank account." Amara's chest constricted with empathy. Malcolm glanced at her, his face a careful mask. "I found out she was seeing someone else. That the entire relationship, everything she'd said, had been a performance." Amara sucked in a sharp breath. She didn't know what to say. This wasn't the perfect Malcolm Reed she had built up in her mind. This was a man who had been betrayed, wounded, and left with scars that were invisible to the world, just like her own. "I haven't really let anyone get close since," Malcolm admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Told myself it was easier that way. Safer." He looked up at her then, his gaze burning into hers. "But then I met you, Amara." She froze, her heart stalling. In that instant, the world fell away. The hospital room, the past hurts, the fear. There was only him and her, and the unspoken truth that stretched between them. "Malcolm," she managed, her voice tight. He shook his head. "No, let me finish." He took a step closer. Her throat constricted. He took another. Now he was right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I don't care what you have or don't have," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't care that you didn't come for money. I don't care that you think you're not good enough for me." His fingers brushed against hers, a tentative, questioning touch, giving her a chance to pull away. She didn't. "All I care about," he whispered, "is you, Amara." Outside, the city lights glittered against the inky sky, the gentle hum of the metropolis filling the silence. Then Malcolm cupped her face in his hands, tilting her chin until their eyes locked. "I want you, Amara," he breathed, his voice thick with feeling. "Just you." And her breath catching in her throat, Amara, for the very first time, let herself believe him. Amara lay awake that night, staring at the acoustic tiles of the hospital ceiling, her heart a tangled mess of emotions she couldn't begin to name. Malcolm's words replayed in her mind, quiet yet unshakable. Asterisk, "I want you, Amara." Just you, asterisk. She had spent so much of her life steeped in the belief that she was inadequate, that she was too plain, that a love like this wasn't in the cards for her. And yet, Malcolm had chosen her. But could she do it? Could she allow herself to trust in this, to trust in him? The next few days were a blur of indecision. Amara avoided his calls, putting off the monumental choice that lay before her, even though a part of her already knew the answer. Because the truth was, when she pictured a life without Malcolm in it, the image was stark and colorless. Something vital was missing. He was missing, and that thought terrified her more than the prospect of falling for him. Malcolm, for his part, waited. He didn't push or demand an answer. He understood Amara. He knew she needed time, and as much as the waiting agonized him, he was willing to endure it. Because if it meant having her in the end, she was worth any amount of patience. But Amara couldn't run from her own heart forever. When the moment came, it wasn't a calculated decision. There was no hesitation, no weighing of pros and cons. There was only a desperate, undeniable need to see him. She ran. She flew down busy sidewalks, a blur against the glowing city lights, her heart pounding a frantic tempo against her ribs until she finally reached the towering glass building of his clinic. She burst through the doors, breathless and wild-eyed, her gaze sweeping the lobby until she spotted him at the far end of the hall, speaking with a nurse. Malcolm turned at the sound, his brow furrowing in surprise. But before he could utter a word, Amara was already closing the distance, moving toward him, moving right into his arms. And for the first time, she held nothing back. Malcolm barely had time to register what was happening before she wrapped her arms around his torso, burying her face in his chest and clinging to him as if he were her only anchor in a storm. His body went rigid with shock for a split second before he melted into the embrace, his own arms coming around her, strong and sure, holding her as if he never intended to let go. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, her voice muffled against the fabric of his shirt. "I don't want to run anymore." Malcolm's breath hitched. And in that moment, everything became clear. She had chosen him. She had chosen them. And nothing else in the world mattered. Amara never imagined she would find herself here, held securely in the arms of a man who had once seemed so impossibly distant, her heart beating in perfect rhythm with his. But now, standing in the quiet of Malcolm's office, his arms a firm haven around her, she knew this was real. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and Malcolm became her steady ground. She still had her moments of doubt, times when the old, insidious voice in her head whispered that she wasn't enough. But every time that fear surfaced, Malcolm was there, reminding her in quiet, steadfast ways that she was everything, that she had always been everything to him. 1 year later, he took her back to the coffee shop where it had all begun. Amara didn't suspect a thing. Not until she saw the nervous way he fiddled with his cup. Not until he reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles on her skin. Not until he slid from his chair and lowered himself to one knee. Right there in the middle of the bustling cafe, a small velvet box in his hand and a universe of love shining in his eyes. Amara gasped, her heart lodging itself in her throat. Malcolm smiled up at her, his voice soft but resonant with certainty. "Amara Wells, will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. A year ago, she would have fled from a moment like this. But now, there was only one possible answer. "Yes," she breathed. Yes, the coffee shop erupted in applause, but all Amara could hear was the thrum of her own heart and the silent, unshakable promise in Malcolm's gaze. They had found each other, and they would never be alone again. And so, Amara and Malcolm's story came full circle. From a nervous encounter in a doctor's office to a love that neither of them had ever anticipated. A woman who believed she was unworthy, and a man who believed he would never trust his heart to another. But love, it turned out, had other plans. It found them not in grand gestures or flawless fairy tale moments, but in the quiet, resolute presence of someone who simply refused to give up. Because in the end, love isn't about finding perfection. It's about finding your person and choosing them over and over again every single day. Wasn't that a journey for the heart? If you were moved by Amara and Malcolm's path to love, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to our channel for more soul-stirring stories. We are dedicated to bringing you heartfelt narratives that resonate long after the final word. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and enable notifications so you never miss a tale that touches your soul. Until we meet again, continue to believe in love, in second chances, and in the beautiful magic of the unexpected. We'll see you in the next story.